Joining us is Dr. Margaret Power, professor of history at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Dr. Power studies women and gender in Latin America with a focus on the political right that led you to the first topic of our interview, Westmoreland County. So take us to Norvelt, a city planned as a New Deal experiment in Coal Patch, Pennsylvania. You grew up there and in 2016 published Hope in Hard Times, Norvelt, and the Struggle for Community during the Great Depression. Could you sketch out the history of the community and then tell us a bit about how the people who live there see themselves today?
Yes. Okay. Before I jump right into talking about Norvelt, I'm going to talk a teeny little bit about Westmoreland County itself. And Westmoreland County, since may not be a place many people are familiar with, Westmoreland County is about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, and the richest bituminous coal seam of coal in the entire world ran through Westmoreland County. And why that was important is because the bituminous coal, and especially the coke that was used as a byproduct of the coal, was what was used to kick off the Industrial Revolution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's the reason why you have people like Andrew Carnegie, um, the Mellon family, and Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick controlled much of the coke producing industry in Westmoreland County. And I think, as everybody knows, the steel industry in Pittsburgh is basically what built, in a sense, the industrial revolution in this country. And that's one reason Westmoreland County is particularly important. One of the main cities that's closest to Norvelt is Latrobe, which many people have say, "Well, I don't know anything about Latrobe," but in fact, Latrobe has four claims to fame. One, Rolling Rock beer, if you've heard of it. Two, home of Arnold Palmer.
That's right.
Three, home of Fred Rogers. And four, for some, the most important, where the banana split was invented. So
That's right.
that's Westmoreland County's claim to fame, and it's right in the foothills of the Laurel Highlands, sort of at the top northernmost edge of the Appalachians. And it is primarily a small a community made up of small towns. And you had earlier mentioned the small coal and coke patch communities. And patch is a word that, as far as I know, is used almost exclusively in Westmoreland County. And a patch community basically is a company town built by the owners of the particular mine, in which the miners who work in those mines are housed. And they were under the very strict control of the mining company, such that the mining company owned the houses. If you worked there, you could live in the houses. The houses were basic, I guess you could call as being somewhat generous. They maybe had running water, they possibly had a coal stove, they had no electricity, and they were wood and very bare minimum. People were allowed, and in fact needed, to have their own gardens surrounding the house to try and bring in some live vegetables. And all of the patch communities had a company store, and many of the company stores were owned not by none other than Frick. So not only did Frick control the coke, he also controlled a lot of the company stores. And typically a company store in Westmoreland County, like a company store everywhere, set much higher prices. And they actually also had what are called the coal and coke police in Pennsylvania. And the coal and coke police were more or less a sort of private militia that was owned and paid for by the mining company. So, for example, if, and you'll see why I mentioned Latrobe, if somebody from Norvelt wanted to go into Latrobe, which was the closest big city, and they were caught by the coal and coke police or reported by somebody, they could be evicted, losing not only their job but also a place to live. So, in terms of the inhabitants, although coal and coke had originally been um, been dug out and processed by miners, especially from Wales and Scotland, sort of northern Europe. As it took off, there began to be this whole attempt to bring in miners from other places, primarily Italians and Eastern Europeans, especially Hungarians, Slavs, and Poles as well. And typically, people from the mining companies would even send recruiters over to someplace like Poland, who would then bring hire laborers to come back, promising them all kinds of things, and then they would come
Yeah.
back and work in the mines. Um, then, what this also set up was two things that were very important. One was this whole tiered. So they had a pay structure system based on where you were from. So if you were a miner from Northern Europe, you automatically got paid more than if you were a miner from Poland or a miner um, from Italy. And in addition, you would get better jobs. So not only was the pay structure higher in a hierarchy, also the what kind of job you would get was in a hierarchy. Not only this, probably another clear distinction was that all these people coming in were Catholic, whereas the original settlers, colonists in Western Pennsylvania, had all been Protestant. Protestant, primarily Germans, some French, but primarily from the British Isles. So this set up this whole tension between the two different populations, which will really um, create a tremendous amount of tension and conflict a little bit further on in the 1920s in terms of the Ku Klux Klan, which I can come back to later, but just to sort of set up this dynamic. And many of the original uh, Eastern European and Southern uh, uh, and Italians who came in. Actually, there was even a distinction made between Northern Italians and Southern Italians. Northern Italians being viewed as racially superior than Southern Italians, and then therefore getting paid more. There were also some black miners in the mines in um, Westmoreland County, but they were then even of a lower rank than the European miners. So people tend to cling to their ethnic background. So a lot of the churches in Westmoreland County to this day, or the social clubs. So, for example, there would be a Hungarian social club, or there would be a Polish social club. I think if for those of you who lived in Chicago, that's also very typical of people in Chicago, that you have all these different kind of clubs, and you'd also
Right.
have churches though. So churches in each of the respective languages, and in some cases where the population was extensive enough, and well, wealthy is not exactly the word because people weren't wealthy, but could afford it, they would have their own church as well.
So then into sort of this sort of dystopian coal mining context where fortunes are being ripped from the earth by migrant workers of a tailorized racial background, and then the Great Depression hits, and these places are laid even lower by the consequences of that economic downturn. And it's into this context where we really start our story, which is about a New Deal community which was set up in Westmoreland County.
A lot of that can be attributed to the efforts of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt was um, very very much influenced by what she had earlier been exposed to in West Virginia. And West Virginia, which was also a very predominantly coal mining industry and area, she came across she traveled around a fair amount visiting people, and in one of her travels, she came across miners in an area right near Morgantown, West Virginia, and what she decided to do was set up a town, a New Deal community, basically. And a New Deal community is a community that gets support from the federal government in order to help the miners who are largely unemployed get a foothold. So it provides houses, providing schools, providing community organizations, in a sense, giving people a lift up. So that it's part of the whole New Deal programming, except this was specifically coordinated by Eleanor Roosevelt. And the name became Arthurdale. And Arthurdale, in a sense, was her baby because she could motor there pretty easily from Washington D.C. It wasn't that long. She was very good friends, or friends with benefits, possibly with a journalist named Lorena Hickok. And Lorena had traveled through Western Pennsylvania, and she had come to the area in Westmoreland County. And what she noticed is that the incredibly devastated communities that people were living in, because actually in Southwest Pennsylvania, the coal mining problems began in the 1920s. They even predated the Depression. So as you
Right.
said, by the time of the Depression, people were it was sort of the depression writ large, or doubled or intensified. So, for example, the coke ovens weren't functioning, the coal mines were barely functioning. If people got work maybe one day a week, that was good. That was really, oh, thank heavens we had something. That was it. That what they got. She found people were sleeping in the coke ovens because they had no place else to live, and they didn't retain heat from centuries from years ago, but they retained heat because of the enclosed structures. They had been built as furnaces in a
Hmm.
sense, and so they were very well built. But people were living in the coke oven. So she reported to Eleanor Roosevelt about this, and Eleanor said, "We've got to do something about it." And so they set up Norvelt, and they worked with also different organization, the American Friends Service Committee, which was a Quaker organization. And the whole concept was, not just are we going to give people homes and give people a great community, we're going to build a collective structure. So the idea was, we're not just building individual homes, we're building a community. So they had all these different mechanisms set up to ensure that. They had study groups to talk about what it means to be part of a collective community. They had community gardens, which would both build people's ability to eat, but also would build a sense of we're working together. They had a dairy co-op. They had a factory in which people worked together, and everything worked out better or worse. It's not as if there was smooth sailing, but I'm sort of, the plan was this. And so then I believe in 1937, it was, the community decided, we've got to give our community a name. It would have been called Westmoreland Homestead. So they said, let's have a different name. So they decided to name the community Norvelt, for Eleanor Roosevelt. And to this day, it is one of, if not the only, New Deal community that continues to exist, is highly functioning. Nor Arthurdale, for example, in West Virginia, there may be some people living there, but it's more viewed as a historic town that you can go visit. And so there's a museum there, you can take a tour of it. But this is a completely functioning community where people live, work, etc.
You know that there was this language about homesteads that sort of
Hmm.
sprang up around these New Deal communities. Of course, homesteading being a reference to the method that was used by the American state to settle the frontier. The only requirement being that you apply, you improve the land, and then it eventually becomes legally yours, right? And I think it's interesting to see that language adopted in this context, right? Because that's what the settlers of Norvelt were called homesteaders. When what's happening here is distinctly different, right,
Hmm.
from uh, the homesteading that settled the American West. What's happening here is that there are significant, capital assets, a home, right, that is being, set up for for mining families, and then just sort of given to them by the state.
Just a couple things that people were never given houses. That what they were given, in a sense, was they were allowed to live in the houses as long as they participated in the community as cooperative members. So in a sense, it was given to them almost like a loan, and they were allowed to purchase a house much later, after World War II ended. So in the late 1940s, they were allowed to purchase it at a very reduced rate. So yes, so that was a distinction between the
Okay.
homesteaders as well. And I think one of the main myths, which really came out to became very clear to me. I was doing a lot of the research in 2008, and the thing during the whole Obama candidacy and then election, and I what I distinctly remember is one, people in the community adored the Roosevelts. They thought the New Deal was the greatest program whatsoever. Meetings in Norvelt are held in the community center, which is called Roosevelt Hall. There's a huge bust of Eleanor Roosevelt. So there's this whole complete focus on the Roosevelts, the Democrats, the New Deal. And at the same time, how I remember this is in 2008, I went to a meeting of the Norvelt Community Historical Society, I bet it was, which is included a lot of people from Norvelt. And it was right after the 2008 election. So they were planning the 75th annual reunion, 75 years after Norvelt became Norvelt. And they had talked about how earlier, some member, I can't remember what member of the Roosevelt family, had attended perhaps the 50th anniversary. So I said, wouldn't it be great if we invited Michelle Obama? There was dead silence. Nobody responded whatsoever. I thought,
Wow.
what happened? Why? These people must be so excited because here's somebody that's to some degree continuing the kind of programs of the Roosevelts. Later, my friend, one of the co-authors of the book, explained to me that most of these people voted against Obama. They would not want Michelle Obama to come here on questions of race. So then I started interviewing people to try and understand, because I had walked in expecting something completely different, thinking that they had the same mentality as their parents or grandparents had in the 1930s. And what a lot of the people told me is some variation of this theme, which was our parents were were in a sense victims of the depression. During the depression, everybody wanted to work. They wanted to work, but they couldn't work because they couldn't find jobs. It was not their fault. Therefore, the government didn't give us a handout. The government gave us the means so that we could, in a sense, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We were not, in a sense, recipients of welfare. We were what I coined the term, which I think probably other people have used, so maybe I didn't coin it, but I used it, the deserving poor. We deserved support from the government because they, meaning the parents and grandparents, because at that point there were not any other original parents or grandparents left alive. They wanted to work, they just couldn't do it. And if you look around the community today, you will see why they were the deserving poor, because all the houses are neat, they're well, the houses, the gardens are very well tended, the roads are very clear, and they would always contrast the safety and security of Norvelt with Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh for them
Right.
Hmm.
was synonymous with black people. So they
Right.
would talk
Oh
about
gosh.
the lack of crime. Here you can leave your door open. Here kids can walk out at night. Here all this is, we never hear gunshots. In a sense, everything was basically saying that we were entitled to what we got, and the proof of the pudding is what a success we are. So then they would tell me about their grandchildren, for example, who had gone to college, or their grandchildren who had gone to college and got a master's or a PhD. And the whole thing was that, see, we're not some moochers that just take out of the system. We are really hardworking people, and that's why we're here. And so I asked people expressly, so what do you think about this? Is in the height of the recession
Right.
in 2008. I said, what do you think about the government doing similar things today? Oh no, that's not right, because a lot of people just take advantage of the government's largesse. I don't know if they use the word largesse, but the government's largesse and about handing out money to people, and that just wouldn't be right. So they made a concrete distinction between their ancestors and people living today, and that has a lot to do with the whole image of the when did black welfare recipients become the face of welfare in this country? And that was basically in the 1960s, whereas up until the 1960s, in fact, I think up until the Kennedy presidency, and through the Kennedy presidency, much of the image of who was poor in this country was the Appalachian whites. Those
Mhm.
Appalachian whites who live up there in those
Right.
mountains and just make whiskey, distill whiskey, and the kids go barefoot, and they're really illiterate. They just marry their cousins. There was this whole
Right.
other different
Right.
trope about the hillbillies,
For sure.
and so that ended, and it ended with especially Johnson and the Great Society, and the idea that actually the government is not just going to be giving welfare to poor whites, it's going to be giving that also to poor black people, and therefore it's like, oh, it's not, we're not just so deserving recipients, and also as a number of white people. So these people were no longer part of the deserving poor. They were financial successes. They had basically
Right.
moved up to the middle class, so they weren't on welfare. But of course, there are plenty of white people who are on welfare, but that became disguised by black people being on welfare.
You talk about this long transition of the politics of the people of Westmoreland County, which trended towards the Republicans since the 1960s, but didn't finally support a Republican president until George W. Bush. What is it that brought this community to that tipping point, though, where it finally in 2008, the politics seem to sort of crystallize around, maybe even particularly that 2008 primary, where certain uh, remaining Democrats in that community may have been nudged in that direction by the rhetoric of that primary.
Um, I think there were two things. One was the idea of taxes. People would talk to us over and over, us being me and my co-authors.
Hmm.
Um, they would talk over and over and over again about the idea of taxes, and for them, taxes meant taking my money, my hard-earned money, and giving it to those lazy black people. That's what taxes meant to them. It
Right.
didn't mean the government doing anything to help society at large, and it also meant a black president. So the combination of a black president who would then even accelerate the process of just giving handouts to people who just won't work for it. I think that's basically what did it in that community, but it's not as if it was just an easy decision, because several people said to me, I can't imagine I'm not voting for a Democrat. I can't imagine I'm voting for a Republican. One person, two people actually said they could not bring themselves to vote for Obama, but nor could they bring themselves to vote um,
Right.
a Republican, and they felt they couldn't because doing so would be a betrayal of their, in this case, their parents. So they just said, "We're not going to vote at all." So
Wow.
it's really interesting to me how intense of a debate some people had, and some people were very embarrassed to say I voted for a Republican, yet they did, and they've continued to vote for Republicans since
Right.
2008.
Is there any sense of the scale of assistance that providing an intergenerational asset like a subsidized home to a family, that this is a much greater form of assistance than welfare checks being sent to black folks in public housing projects in the mid 20th century, right? That in reality, those are very, very different levels of support, right?
Mhm.
Is there is there any is there any attempt to sort of like reconcile the that like if the government were building and subsidizing individual family homes for poor people today, the people living in Westmoreland County would call it socialism, and yet the welfare queens have their hands out in a way that is different and less deserving. um and I just would be curious if you had talked to anybody who who tried to directly address just the scale of an intergenerational capital asset versus welfare checks.
If you get a welfare check, it usually goes to cover your expenses, which means, as you said, it's not a capital asset. What I also would say is that what happened with all these families is almost every single one of them would talk about how they not only had the house, they expanded the house. And
Mhm.
that was, in a sense, just sort of, again, the tangible proof that they were a success. So that they would say, this is what the house used to look like, and this is what the house is now. Or they would talk about their children's success, and the tangible proof would be the size of the house the children lived in. So the houses
Right.
became a real symbol of material success, and indeed
Mm.
of capital success. A house in Norvelt is now a highly coveted house because again, back to Eleanor Roosevelt, because of her intercession, she demanded that the houses be extremely well built and that they have indoor plumbing. So many people for the first time had a toilet, had running water, had some kind of an internal heating system that was not a coal or coke stove. So these are
Wow.
houses that have weathered. It's almost, well, let's say 80 years later, they are in great shape.
Right. Not falling apart
Hmm.
after 30 years like Cabrini Green or
Not
something
at
like that.
all. These are really well built houses.
In rural America broadly, people underestimate the role of the capture of local media by corporate outlets. Can you tell us a bit about the role of the Tribune Review
Hmm.
in the political transformation of Norvelt?
Yes, and it's not just of Norvelt, of Westmoreland County. So the Scaife Mellon, who's no longer with us, immense wealth, incredible wealth, extreme right wing, sort of on the way out there kind of fringe. Like, um, by the by, had a very messy divorce from his wife, who then got a lot of money and gave everything she possibly could to left wing causes to spite her husband. One can only appreciate her a little bit.
But this is Mellon,
Scaife
this is
Mellon.
an heir,
Yeah,
right?
to the
Scaife Mellon,
Mellon.
an
Yeah.
heir to the wealth
The
that was
mouth.
pulled out of this region. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So basically, what he did, he began to buy a lot of the local newspapers in the southwestern Pennsylvania area and began pumping out incredible, incredible right wing garbage in all these publications. And so the Chicago Tribune, the Greensburg Tribune Review, which had been, I guess you could say, sort of conservative newspaper, but in this very democratic county, began to completely um, go against every single Democratic program, accusing them of corruption, basically saying the Democratic Party and the unions and the mafia, it's one big thing. And
Mm.
sort of every position that the right wing has taken on a national and international level was funneled through this newspaper. And it was the main, and it had a wide circulation in the Westmoreland County area.
Mm.
So it basically was probably one of the most influential sources of news that people got. This was this was before Fox News. This was before a lot of the talk shows, sort of the right wing media hosts. This really had a very big impact on how people thought about things, and it was the local newspapers. There are a few holdouts still to this day. Actually, just lately, people I'm in touch with people. There are people who've been saying there has been the beginnings of some coverage of there's an organization in Westmoreland County called Voice of Westmoreland, and it's a nonpartisan but very progressive organization that has started with the 2016 election of Trump to deal specifically with people's needs, and is focused on healthcare and housing and being very socially,
Hmm.
racially, gender or sexual orientation inclusive. So there's never been an organization like that in Westmoreland County. They're starting to get some actually fairly positive coverage in the Tribune Review now.
Hmm.
So that has had a very big impact on people. Plus, to some extent, the Catholic Church, which still people, it's a very predominantly Catholic or Catholic county community. The Catholic Church has had varying more progressive, very conservative people. So they also have preached from the pulpits, for example, telling people to vote, say, against Obama. And um, it's just people getting it on all these different levels. I grew up in Westmoreland County, as I said before, but I grew up a Republican. I grew up in a very, very conservative family. So my whole sense was that what I was told was that Democrats are corrupt. They're just in it for the money. They run the mafias. They extort things. You can't trust them. And then that, which was held by a minority population in Westmoreland County, has now become the larger sense of what people in the community think. And the interesting thing to me, especially, is that the whole face of the Republican Party has changed. Whereas before, the Republican Party was more the elite that they belonged to the country clubs. They belonged
Right.
to something called
Right.
Rolling Rock. They had horse races. That was who they are. Now, an incredibly high percentage of the Republican Party consists of the children of former Democrats and former miners, union people. So
Right.
these are people who grew up in pro-union households in which the Democratic Party, John Lewis and Roosevelt, were on the walls of all these people that they grew up with. But now these are people who voted for Trump, and Trump
Mhm.
is is revered by so many people in Westmoreland County. There's something called the Trump House, and the Trump House was one of these wealthy white women, of course, bought a house and painted it red, white, and blue, and has a huge, probably 10 to 15 high, not a statue, but more cardboard, but a substantial cardboard figure of Trump outside the house. It's been
Wow.
there since 2016, and during both the 2016 and the 2020 elections, would open the house. People could come by and get Trump signs for the yard, Trump bumper stickers, Trump petitions, Trump paraphernalia. And they had so much money, they just handed everything out to people. You didn't have to pay for anything.
Right. And I think it's interesting, Donald Trump was widely understood to lack an electoral ground game. And so to hear the description of sort of how things were organized in Westmoreland County is really interesting. And
Oh, yeah.
it wouldn't surprise me if you went and looked, you might find more Trump houses
Yeah.
in more little
Yeah.
communities, being
Mhm.
organized largely independent of any like campaign structure.
Trump most recently had a huge, massive rally. He landed at the Arnold Palmer Airport and held a massive rally, unmasked, in Westmoreland County. Let's see, probably January, February, March, something like that. No, not January. It's February after that. But in both the elections, especially the most recent election, these Trump supporters organized something called the Trump mobile, in which they would have a Trump mobile and go around delivering supplies and organizing rallies, and there'd be tons of car caravans going throughout the community, and so many yard signs
Hmm.
about Trump. So it was sort of this whole propaganda barrage as if Trump is the person.
Especially as we think about like the role of the Tribune Review and this purchasing of rural media by large corporate entities in the United States as something that's gone on everywhere,
Yeah.
right? Something in Illinois, there's the Sinclair Media Group
Yeah, Sinclair's the big
downstate,
one.
right,
Yeah.
which owns everything for a string of papers from St. Louis to
Oh.
Charleston, Illinois, and and I think that's just one of many examples in Norvelt where you have, there just maybe a more obvious example of sort of the contradictions of our ideology in this country, where we're all the inheritors of massive efforts by the American state to everything from clearing indigenous people off the land to building railroads to all of these other state investments which were instrumental to the accrual of wealth in the United States, right? And that we're all living at downstream of that, and yet have politics that are oftentimes incoherent or willfully ignorant of that historical background. And I think that that's true not just in Norvelt, but in most places in the
Mhm.
United States. It's just
Mhm.
it's just in Norvelt where we can see them a little bit more clearly.
I think you're completely right. Westmoreland County is not some isolated example, and which it's also why I'm working on Westmoreland County, because I think it's an example that has been largely overlooked about what is going on in these rural communities on a real nitty gritty level, not just sort of how do people vote, but how do these shifts happen? And it's actually I'm doing a new research project that's looking at the history of race relations in Westmoreland County beginning in the early
Mhm.
20th century, because I realize I sort of scratched the surface. I'm a Latin Americanist, so it's not like I didn't know that much about the own county,
Right.
the history I grew up in. It's really interesting. I feel it's also important to learn if we understand it there. I think then it will help us to understand a similar phenomenon in similar types of communities, although each one is distinct, each one is unique, sort of. But I think this whole rural, um, semi-rural reality is very underexplored.
Have you been paying attention to the hurricane?
It's like I've seen it in the background and I haven't
It
actually
is
clicked on any
bad.
of the links.
They're saying it's
Yeah.
the worst storm to hit Louisiana since the 1850s.
Wow. That's saying something.
And they're saying it
Uh,
might reach category 5. So,
is it
Ida.
so it's nearing landfall right
Yeah.
now.
There's
It
already
has
storm
not yet.
surge in like coastal Mississippi.
Scientists are saying at this point, like, no, like the extreme weather events are becoming and will become more extreme.
Yeah.
So that
More
we
frequent,
are
more
getting,
extreme. Yeah.
yeah, that we're actually getting to that point where, like, when a hurricane hits and you go, or like when we have a a weather event,
Mm,
right? People are increasingly saying climate change, right? And I remember 10, 15 years ago or something, the people who understood climate change would always be like, no, there's a difference between individual weather events and climate, right? And that because because the thing that was so frequent 10 or 15 years ago was that you'd have like a cold snap, and because
yeah.
everyone was saying global warming at the time,
Hmm.
all the pointy headed dorks would be like, it's not about weather, it's about climate, whatever. And
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we're getting to the point now where even the scientists are like, looking at the 10-day forecast and going, look at this shit, or the heat wave in California, or
Yeah.
the
I mean,
drought
it's
in the West in general. Like these
right.
are all now being attributed to climate change.
it's important to remember too. I mean, climate science itself has like come a long way within the past 20 years in particular. And that sort of rapid advancement is what's behind, I mean, like the recent UN report,
Hmm.
um, and sort of the legitimacy and accuracy of what's being said in that document. And that's like, I think it's just, it reminds me of that meme. It's like a bar, and then like the majority of the bar is like, oh, climate change, whatever, and
Hmm.
then it's like there's a skinnier one. It's like, oh crap, like this is serious, and then the last one is like this tiny sliver on the scale of time, and it's like, oh,
Right.
we're fucked.
Right.
This week in Afghanistan, the U.S. continued to evacuate its troops and civilian collaborators as it warned of threats of terror attacks against the Kabul airport. Well, lo and behold, the attack the U.S. knew about for days in advance was finally carried out. 70 Afghan civilians were killed, many in an ensuing firefight led by U.S. personnel against Taliban and perceived ISIS-K militants.
And something like 13 U.S. Armed Service
Mm-hmm.
members were killed as well. And I think it's interesting that a lot of Western media outlets, the headline will just be the U.S. troop deaths. You know, 70 Afghan civilians have died,
Yeah.
but the New York Times headline is 13, you know, U.S. soldiers dead in attack in Kabul, right?
Oh yeah. I even read like yesterday in, I think it was like the New Republic. Even they, an outlet like that, their headline ran as 13 servicemen killed,
Yeah.
and they at the very end of that lead paragraph, it was just something like, and a score of Afghan civilians. That was it. Just no like that. Just a very brief mention of that, not mentioning that the actual figure being 70 or around 70
Right.
compared to the 13 you know U.S. servicemen and women. So
And it's worth noting that the attacks came the same week as Murtaza Hussein's report for The Intercept that CIA funded militias responsible for the massacre of Afghan civilians have gone uninvestigated by Biden's new national intelligence director, Avril Haines.
And Haynes is known for being the one person in the Obama administration that would say, hey, maybe don't double tap this school bus, or saying, whoa there, you can't drop a Predator missile on this wedding. That's not a vibe.
And remember, this is called restraint in the halls of power.
Anyway, Hussein wrote this week that the Biden administration has repeatedly promised to turn the page on the scandal ridden tenure of its predecessor and to bring moral considerations to U.S. foreign policy. Indeed, Biden signaled as much by elevating Avril Haines to Director of National Intelligence.
But Haynes' reputation for restraint shouldn't be interpreted as dovish. The Democrats' policy of page turning in the war on terror isn't about anything more than legal ass covering, which is what Haynes' job was, to determine the amount of suffering that we can inflict without setting off the media or the folks at The Hague. Meanwhile, we're all just supposed to ignore the fact that all the Western powers had 2 days warning for this attack, and that a ton of the actual casualty list was just people we shot after the fact. Furthermore, the CIA's fingerprints are all over this. We have a Taliban opposition group able to pull off a suicide attack with the advanced warning of essentially the entire world. That would seem genuine, except that they're precisely the type of group the CIA has been funding for almost 30 years.
We basically have one official source within all of Western media that I've been able to find that's not necessarily confirmed this, but has at least brought it up based on eyewitness accounts locally after the suicide bombing occurred. There was an initial string of reports that U.S. soldiers fired upon Afghan citizens after the blast, and I think his name is pronounced Sekunder Kermani. He is the BBC reporter for Pakistan and Afghanistan, that region. The story that has emerged is that the blast happened, and then U.S. Soldiers turned basically and fired upon Afghan civilians. But the original storyline that we've been hearing about this has been all of these Afghan civilians were killed by the blast itself. But the indications from some of these accounts is that no, it wasn't the blast itself that killed the majority of these Afghan civilians. It was U.S. soldiers firing upon them for whatever reason. So, of course, people on Twitter have speculated, why is this happening? Why would they have done this? Did they turn and start firing at any and everyone in a panic? Or, was there a more deliberate and sinister orchestration behind why they decided to fire upon Afghan civilians?
The Kabul airport is known to be the only place that the United States is really still sort of like controlling, like the footprint of the airport itself. And so for there to be an attack, right, in that one place in all of Afghanistan that we're controlling, that was warned of for 2 days in advance, right, and that was ultimately carried out by a Taliban opposition group in the one part of Afghanistan that the United States controls, right? Is the type of thing that any honest and skeptical person should reserve judgment on, as far as the cause and contributor to making that happen. We understand who funds the opposition groups to the Taliban at this point, and who will fund and continue to fund the opposition groups to the Taliban.
Yeah. The important thing to like sort of take home from here is that the US, the intelligence community, that apparatus itself has something to gain by creating an unstable, situation within a Taliban controlled Afghanistan. So at least the logic behind them, funding an opposition group has historical precedence, and in this situation it makes sense for what their sort of, strategic goals might be. Exactly. So
right, because at this point the Taliban is trying to present to the world a air of competence, right, of calm, right. That's the only thing that they can be doing right now, which actually puts them in a very vulnerable position, and and means that the destabilizing of that facade is in the interest of the American state.
They just overran a U.S. sponsored government. So why in the world would the U.S. overnight just all of a sudden want to be supporters of the Taliban? Of course they're not going to. The Intelcom apparatus is going to want to destabilize the group that overran their sponsored government.
Just last week we read U.S. Intelcom apparatus folks who have said that Afghanistan is now a problem, for our rivals on the international scene, right? That's what Thomas Friedman was talking about with the Shah of Afghanistan. That, to the extent that Afghanistan becomes a problem for our rivals is now in the interest of the American state. And if the Taliban are successful in imposing a stable regime there, then it's not accomplishing that objective, that very clearly articulated foreign policy objective of the American state, which is that Afghanistan remains a problem for the people, or for the people we're competing with on the international stage.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's probably going to be, as we've kind of discussed, off the mic, it's going to be a little bit of time before we get potentially any sort of serious journalistic investigation done on the possibility that U.S. troops fired upon Afghan civilians. So I suspect that some of your more, I guess, I don't know, just outlets like The Intercept, whoever else, we should expect some sort of reporting if it's to be done by them. But I think it's going to take probably a little bit of time for confirmation of that to occur. Meaning, someone's going to have to go over there and and basically round up 24 eyewitnesses and talk to them about what they saw, and then write the story basically, and that could take time. But I mean, the second that story comes out, though, that's huge And I sure hope, Jin Saki gets questioned about that in a press conference.
Yep. And for some of the things we speculated about here, it may take 25 years
Yeah.
before any of it
Right.
is actually confirmable. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, that is the nature of the material we so often deal with on this show. After 2 weeks of waiting for aid, the most remote parts of Haiti have begun to receive supplies and resources to combat the devastation wrought by a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, which occurred there a couple weeks ago.
And freelance photographer Octavio Jones, followed a Chinook of U.S. Service members who traveled to remote villages in the mountainous southern part of Haiti to drop massive cardboard boxes of rice to the people stranded in the communities, accessible often only by dirt road.
This comes in the foreground of a Haitian state reeling from an elite squabble over the national government, which culminated in the assassination of President Jovenel Moise last month. The caretaker government under Ariel Henry is viewed as weak and illegitimate in the eyes of the Haitians.
And a New York Times story from last week emphasizes that the Haitians expect no help from the state, with quotes like this from a 66-year-old farmer. Quote, "I don't expect any help. We're on our own, and no one trusts the government here."
Meanwhile, only 21,000 of the 11 million people in Haiti had been vaccinated against COVID-19 as of August 20th. Meanwhile, hospitals have been destroyed along with hundreds of schools across the worst affected provinces.
A Catholic priest near La Sille said that Haitians are living in a, quote, failed state.
Aside from the horrific, and intensifying, climate issue, right?
Yeah.
You also have this other imposed condition of the North
Mhm.
Atlantic, which is the cycle of national bourgeois government
Right.
in the global south, right? Where the local capitalists are, just sort of competing and jockeying for control of the state and repressing any street movement that, might attempt to even just alter or intervene in that process, regardless of its intentions, just like, impose some semblance of democracy over a place like Haiti. When you see the sort of awful convergence of climate and imperialism, the mind just kind of reels to come up with solutions, right? But I think
Yeah.
it's worth thinking about the Haitian people, right?
Yeah.
And what are our moral responsibilities and obligations, given our relationship with the American state.
Yeah, I love how they've been just saying, "Oh, it's nothing to worry about." They've been saying that for 2 months now, and look where we're at.
Yeah, I love that they're talking about it like they've just like put some tape on the front grille of the car
Yeah.
or something.
I mean,
We're
that's
talking,
exactly what Biden's been saying to the American public for the past 2 months, is that, or have there not been multiple quotes of him being like, "This isn't like a huge deal. Like the Fed will do its job, yada yada yada." Like,
right. I mean, the principle here is that, you know, even though you might see something like a, $25,000 used Honda Civic just out there on the used car market, that nonetheless the increase in inflation running the economy hot, as the Biden administration has referred to it this past week, is ultimately in the interests of driving economic growth at a moment of otherwise economic stagnation during the hoped recovery from the economic shortfalls of the COVID-19 pandemic. The White House doubled its inflation forecast, though, this past week, while wages and salaries continue to lag behind the consumer price index, right? So the prices of things are going up faster than wages and salaries, Nonetheless, we have inflation, which tells us that wherever the economic growth is in the economy right now, it's not in the pockets of normal folks.
And Jason Furman, a Harvard economist and former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, points out that the United States is experiencing significantly higher inflation than other countries that are facing the same supply problems. Consumer prices rose 2.2% in the year that ended in July in the euro area, compared with 5.4% in the United States.
In the Keynesian logics of the post 2008 world, this is rational neoliberalism. People are hurting. The economy needs to run hot so people can get jobs, even if that means we drive inflationary rates for a bit.
And despite neoliberalism's origins as anti-Keynesian economic ideology, the reformist neolibs re-embraced Keynes after 2008 crisis. The logic of the move seems sound, certainly preferable to the austere responses of neoconservatives in these situations.
The issue, of course, is that there's no guarantee that there will be any continuity at all in this policy. Driving inflation is fine if you can keep that Keynesian tool belt at the helm of the American economy. But our one-term loser, now managing a foreign policy loss in the Middle East, will turn power over to the neocons in 2024, almost certainly. And we'll just have to see what austerity does in the wake of these types of policies. So I did want to mention that. So there were like a couple of things that were like supposed to happen this week that like basically didn't, that like were about to happen but didn't. One of them was that on the morning of the bombing at the airport in Kabul, Biden was set to meet with the new Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett.
Yep.
Which was canceled right shortly before. And then as well, that the Supreme Court was set to rule on the Remain in Mexico policy. And, you know, I know what the headlines saw, but they really, you know, sort of took a punt on it, right? They said that, you know, the Biden administration, you know, could not end the Remain in Mexico policy because they had not demonstrated that the policy was, quote, arbitrary and capricious, end quote, enough. And thus they needed another basis for ending the policy, which has created tent cities of asylum seekers on the southern border. Then again, we're also at the end of August in year one, right? And remember, like, this was the fascism, right?
Yeah.
Like, that Joe Biden ran against. And here we are, like, whatever argument the Biden administration has been, like, making, you know, in favor of ending this policy, you know, wasn't sufficient enough to show that it was arbitrary and capricious enough. Like, I mean, you know, I think the focus in this story has been on the Supreme Court's failure to do X, Y, or Z, right? Or oh, look how, you know, conservative this court is. It's like, well, how do you fail to effectively argue to a bunch of nerds on the Supreme Court that the Biden administration's policy was arbitrary and capricious? I mean, what sort of limp dick shit did you trot out, you know, that, you know, that a year ago, less than a year ago, you were running on to get elected to office? This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.